Hey gang, Volty here. I have bad news. Ugin, Eye of the Storms from Tarkir Dragonstorm has eaten the color pie. Let's get into it. In 1996, Pokemon Gen 1 was released in Japan under Pokemon Red and Green, and then in 98 it was re-released in the US under Pokemon Red and Blue. The Pokemon types were a very delicately balanced mechanic. Fire beats grass, grass beats water, water beats fire. There were 15 types at the start. They had a very complicated type chart in kind of a rock, paper, scissors amalgamation, and there was only one type in the game that was not super effective against any of the other types, which was the normal type. This is very critical, so out of the 15 types, everything was super effective against something else, and was good against something else, except the normal type. In 1999, 3 years later, we had Gold and Silver, and we had 2 new types added to the Pokemon type chart, which were Steel and Dark. These changed a lot of the relationships, but overall, people understood that Steel and Dark types were very good. From Gen 2 to 5, there were a couple of minor tweaks that were made to the type chart, mainly to fix things, and there were a couple of relationship changes, but most of the time when we talk about the Gen 2 to Gen 5 era, the most changes that happened to the game were parts of the functionality. So we had the physical special split, we had weather changes, etc. In 2013, 14 years after Gen 2, we had Gen 6 introduced. We had X and Y. They were released and they had one brand new type to the mix, which was the Fairy type. It was meant to balance the previous type chart and make a couple of things more powerful, a couple of things less powerful, mainly directed at the Dragon type. Now, can you guess, out of the 18 total types we've had in Pokemon for almost 30 years, what the 2 best types are? That's right, it's Fairy, the newest type, and Steel, one of the 3 newest types. That's it. That's the punchline. Now, in 1993, Limited Edition Alpha was released, and we had 290 cards across 5 colors. These colors were designed in a cohesive configuration named the Color Pie, and it was meant to display the strengths and weaknesses and relationships of the colors with each other. Cards could also be colorless and were inherently weaker as they had no strengths because they weren't backed by the strength of a color, and they were not especially or super effective against any one particular color or strategy. Now, from 93 to the December of 2015, so 22 years, no changes whatsoever were made to this formula. There were a couple of tweaks and adjustments to the color pie, so white drifted a bit away and more towards the creatures, despite having Wrath of God in the first set, and then, green has gone from very large creatures to middle of the pack creatures, but the core idea of 5 colors, and then the cards that don't fit those 5 colors was completely unchanged. And then in January of 2016, Oath of the Gatewatch was released. It was meant to be a relatively small set that came after a larger set, Battle for Zendikar, but it came with the biggest shakeup since Planeswalkers in Lorwyn 9 years prior. A 6th color was introduced, the Colorless color. This is the biggest change that Magic has had to its color identity or the color chart ever, and it's not close. From here on out, I'm going to be distinguishing cards as colorless or generic, and we'll get to that in a moment. So in the top right of these 2 cards, there is a mana symbol that is not any of the previous mana symbols or a number. So previously we had a number which signified generic mana, and then red, white, green, blue, or black. And now we have a sixth color, which is the colorless color. In order to cast these cards, you must have colorless mana in your mana pool when you attempt to cast them. Thought-Knot Seer cannot be cast off 4 mountains, where Juggernaut can. So, what did this do? Basically, colorless no longer meant those that were of none of the colors. It now had its own identity, it had its own basic land in wastes, and it had its own seat at the table. Previously, the 5 colors were in harmony. We had allied bonds, so white was friendly with blue and green, and we had enemy bonds. White was anti-red and black. Where would colorless fit in to this pentagram? And the short answer is that it didn't. Colorless was not allied with anyone and anything, and it was an enemy to the other 5 colors. This is a very interesting choice for a relationship spectrum, and we'll get into how that's changed things over time. Following its release, Oath of the Gatewatch fueled Eldrazi decks across multiple formats, and Modern by far copped the most. These decks were not engines centered around key cards, they were just undercosted and overpowered creatures that were cheating on mana, mostly because of the printing of Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple 6 years prior. But what's critical is that you were not playing cards that didn't have a color, you were not playing generic cards, which are weaker than colored cards. You were playing cards that were colorless. You were playing the 6th color. It won the first Pro Tour, it completely dominated the field, and across every single modern event in the months and years prior, until Eye of Ugin was banned, it was very, very good. We did not see the return of the colorless mana symbol for 9 years, until MH3 in 2024. And in MH3, when we saw the return of the colorless mana symbol, it was very, very good. Glaring Fleshraker and Kozilek's Command are just a small tease of MH3, and these cards have been everywhere across every format since they've been printed. It's a simple fact that colorless as a color is very, very good compared to the other 5 colors. Over the 2 sets, so Oath of the Gatewatch and MH3, the core identity of colorless has been you should go all in on colorless, that should be the color that you play. You're not playing a mono-colored deck in terms of mono-white, you're playing a mono-colorless deck. The best decks that play colorless cards have them in a really large quantity, you're usually playing 30 to 40 of them, and there is a very high synergy between your threats and your mana base. And this is very critical. Most of the lands in Magic's history that tap for more than 1 mana make colorless or generic mana. There are a couple of exceptions like Tolarian Academy and Gaia's Cradle, but for the vast majority of Magic's history, if you have a land that works as more than 1 land, it makes colorless or generic mana. This then leads into the real core issue of the colorless color. So, for example, we have Ancient Tomb, Cloudpost, Temple. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the lands that make more than 1 mana. So these are the soul lands. There are a couple that make more than 2, but it's basically akin to Soul Ring, which makes 2 mana for 1 mana. The purpose of these lands, and a very big part of their design philosophy, was to give a choice to players who are attempting to use them. If you wanted your lands to make more mana than your basic lands, you had to choose one of 2 things. You had to spend it, the generic mana, on the generic portion of your cards, and occasionally have 2 little colored mana in your mana base. So for example, if you're playing a mono red deck, but you have 3 and 4 drops, Ancient Tomb can accelerate you and act as 2 mountains. However, if you actually need a mountain, Ancient Tomb cannot give you that colored mana. The second choice was to play a critical quantity of generic cards to abuse the extra mana that you would get. This is meant to be offset by the weaker potency of individual generic cards. I think Mishra's Workshop is the perfect example of this. The land adds 3 mana, but it can only be spent on artifacts, and at the time, artifacts were weaker than colored cards. So in order to abuse the extra mana that you would get out of your lands, you had to play weaker individual cards. And that's the core issue with the colorless color. It circumvents this choice that was meant to be presented to players when the soul lands were created and designed. As an aside, generic cards have remained in the game throughout its lifespan. So in Oath of the Gatewatch and in MH3 we had colorless cards, but since the first set in 1993, there have always been cards that do not cost colored mana. And the idea of generic cards is that they are cards without a color, and they have lower power, and they don't have the strength of a color's backing. And that idea has survived through hundreds of design philosophies. It has survived through every single gimmick. Every single set has generic cards. It has cards that are very expensive, but are weaker than if you were to play a 4 green creature, for example. It has mana rocks that are regularly printed. We've seen cheap creatures that have minor effects, but they're incredibly easy to cast. What you would get for an expensive generic card has changed over the course of, 32 years, but the shift themselves between generic cards over time hasn't been incredible. The difference between a single blue card in 1993 and now is a much bigger gap than a single generic versus a single generic now. Here is a quick list of some cards that were very, very playable during their time across multiple formats that were generic cards. So we've got Wormcoil as a big beater, we've got Khan as the first colorless planeswalker, All Is Dust as a sweeper, Emrakul the Aeon's Torn as your big game-ending creature, Ugin the Spirit Dragon as an All Is Dust that was also a win con, and then in more recent years, Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, which is a big payoff creature. So in terms of the power level of a card, once you start hitting really, really expensive costs, hasn't actually changed super dramatically compared to each of the 5 colors. Now, in MH3, there was a shift, and we'll get to that. Basically, when you spend generic mana, you're meant to get generic cards. The more mana you spent, the better the card, but it was still, for the most part, meant to be worse than a similar card at a similar price point that was in a color. If you are playing a 6-drop and it is generic, it should be less powerful than any 6-drop in any color. That is just how the game was designed. Oath of the Gatewatch wasn't super symptomatic, and it wasn't very obvious that this was a problem when they introduced the colorless color, because the Eye of Ugin interaction with cheap Eldrazi creatures, which they have admitted was an oversight, for the most part eclipsed any information we could have gained from Oath of the Gatewatch in terms of whether or not this mechanic was not okay. MH3, however, was different. The cards you played at their price points were as powerful or more powerful than similar costed cards. And this firmly cemented the idea that colorless was a color now. And it was the 6th color. So here we can see Kozilek's Command, which is as powerful as any X spell that you could play in any color. We have Glaring Fleshraker, which is just an incredibly powerful 3-drop creature. If this was in any of the colors, it would be very, very good. It that Heralds the End, which is just meant to be a grizzly bear, but it's also a mana dork and it's also an anthem. And Devourer of Destiny, which has an upkeep trigger for the first turn of the game, and a cast trigger, and is a big threat. So even though these cards are colorless, and you can use generic mana to pay for them, they are as powerful as any colored spell. And thankfully, the big difference was that MH3 was not a standard legal set, so its power ceiling was raised because the cards were being injected into Modern and Legacy and Vintage, and so they were allowed to be more powerful because they wouldn't impact Standard. So for example, Kozilek's Command is showing up everywhere. It's very, very good in every format, and their cards themselves are very, very powerful, but the Standard and the Pioneer players who are meant to be playing a lower powered format were kept safe from MH3. In the second week of April 2025, so in 3 weeks from the time of recording, Tarkir Dragonstorm will become standard legal. And in most sets, and just like in this one, there is a splashy new mythic that is meant to encourage people to buy packs. And that card is Ugin, Eye of the Storms. Reading this card, I did not think it was real the first time I saw this card, until I saw multiple arts and realized that this was a card that was going to be in the standard format and legal for the entire time in every single format. This card is not okay. For 7 mana, you get a 7 loyalty Planeswalker. That makes it absurdly hard to kill. Khan Liberated started on 6, and its best ability was -3. Ugin, Eye of the Storms costs 7, and its best ability ticks it up to 9. However, that's its best Planeswalker activated ability of +2, gain 3 life, draw a card. Its actual best abilities are static abilities attached to the card, and that is the first line of text, which is when you cast this spell, exile up to 1 target permanent, that's 1 or more colors, and the second ability, which is whenever you cast another colored spell, or colorless spell, you can exile up to 1 target permanent, that's 1 or more colors. If you play Ugin, Eye of the Storms, you get to blow up one thing before you have activated your Planeswalker. If your Ugin, Eye of the Storms, gets countered, you still get to blow something up. If you play Ugin, Eye of the Storms, and forget to activate its activated abilities, it is still good. If you simply never activate any of the 3 abilities, and you play a single colorless spell after you play Ugin, on a following turn, on a much later turn, it will gain you 7 life, it will blow something up, and then probably blow something else up. If you do decide to activate its abilities, you win the game. This is a short list of what a 7 or more mana generic card looks like. A lot of these cards have been playable across multiple formats, and that's why I've listed these particular options. We've got All Is Dust, Cityscape Leveler, Godfarer's Gift, Kaldra Complete, Khan Liberated, Meteor Golem, Mere Battlesphere, Phyrexian Colossus, which won a PT, Platinum Angel, Sire of 7 Deaths, Sundering Titan, Ugin the Spirit Dragon, and Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. All of these cards are very, very good. I haven't checked the stats, but I'm fairly confident all of these have won multiple high-level tournaments across their lifespan. And some of these cards are really, really new. This is what a 7 mana colorless card is meant to look like. We have Breaker of Creation, which is an 8 mana gain life card that's kind of hard to kill. We have Deceiver of Form, which is just terrible. Devourer of Destiny, which is very, very good. Flayer of Loyalty, which is very bad. Kozilek the Great Distortion, which is quite bad. And Rise of the Eldrazi, the spell, which is basically unplayable. Paying 7 mana and paying a colorless card is not meant to be good. Because when you spend 7 mana, you need to be doing something incredibly high impact. And the only reason that 7 mana generic cards have such a long pedigree is that they've existed in far more formats. But when you look at this list, and then you think of all the cards that use colorless mana specifically, that cost 7 or more mana, the list grows really quickly to a bunch of cards that were very, very, very good. Devourer of Destiny is technically the mainly playable card on this list. However, we have cards like Worldbreaker, which requires you to use colorless mana, and we also have a bunch of cards that are cheaper than these that are as powerful as these other cards. Thought-Knot is better than every card on this list. Reality Smasher during Eldrazi Winter was better than all of the cards on this list. And so here's the crux of the issue. Ugin, Eye of the Storms, is better than every single card that has ever been printed that costs either 7 generic mana or a combination of generic and colorless mana. The only competitors to Ugin, Eye of the Storms at this cost are cards that are being cheated out, like Mere Enforcer, or have cost-reducing effects. Things like Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, that you never actually pay 15 for example. Most of the cards that are designed to be cheated out, or played for less than 7 mana, are worse than Ugin, Eye of the Storms. It is the best generic card they have ever printed because it should be colorless. When you look at the card and you compare it to other colorless cards, it fits right in. If it was 5 colorless, it would fit right in. And it would still be the best card at that cost. But because it is not colorless, it is completely broken out of the colorless color, which now causes a real problem. I understand why WotC made a 6th color. I do not understand why they did not use it for this card. Ugin is gonna rip through everything. It is going to eat every slice of the color pie one at a time. Good luck, everyone. So that's it for Ugin. I want to give a big shout out to my March patrons and donors. If you want to support me financially, there's going to be a link down below where you can join the Patreon. I stream twice a week for the VFN series, so you can come hang out if you would prefer to do that instead. But I really do want to thank everyone who's been supporting me throughout the time of Volti, because it's been helping me make content, and I really enjoy making stuff like this. If you have any ideas or if you have any feedback or comments about Ugin, Eye of the Storms, please leave a comment. But otherwise, that's it from me. Volti out.